So now that we have validation for both of our inputs in our button, the next thing we need to do is have the entire form validation implemented. If either of these inputs has an error, we should disable the button, and if both of them are valid, we're going to enable the button. The only problem is that at the moment with our current architecture, this is a little bit difficult to implement. The only way to know the value of the input is down here inside of the input, but to enable valid or invalid for the button, it's going to be up in the app state. What we need to do is have some way to enable this based on the value of username and password. And we aren't actually using these at the moment. So what we're going to do is move the value out of the input up into data inside of the app component, and then we're going to have a much easier time validating everything. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is delete this data function here, and instead of putting the value here, we're going to make it a prop. So I'm just going to have a value prop, and the type is going to be a string. So let's just go ahead and define that one as well. Now that we've done that, we have to go ahead and somehow pass this prop down and make sure everything is still working. So what I'm going to do is something I've used previously and found to be quite successful for most forms other than the really complicated ones. And instead of having just a string here, what I'm going to do is have an object with two keys, the value, which is going to be the string, and we're also going to have a valid attribute here, and this is going to be false by default. And what we're going to do is keep track of the valid state up here in app.view. We're going to duplicate this for password as well, so I'm just going to copy and paste that one down here now. And what we need to do now is pass the value prop correctly. So what I'm going to do is have a value binding up here, and we're just going to pass in username.value. And we're going to do the same thing for password, so I'm going to jump down here and put in password.value. Now that we've done this, we can save it off and see if everything is still working. And if we jump over here, we're going to see that it's actually not going to be working. And the reason for this is, although we're passing the prop correctly down here, and we can validate that by coming and updating username and putting this to be user, for example, we haven't got any way to communicate from the input component up to the app. At the moment, we have one-way communication. We have app passing the value down to input, but we haven't got the opposite direction. So what we need to do is implement my input and have some way to communicate with app. We have seen this before using the emit pattern, and that's what we're going to do here. So what I'm going to do is jump over here. Instead of using vModel, we're not using this anymore. We're just going to use a regular value binding, and we're going to bind to the value prop. And we're also going to listen for the input event. And when that is typed into, we're going to call an input function. And remembering, if we don't have any parentheses here, it's going to give us the native JavaScript event as the value. The next thing I'm going to do is jump down and define a new method. So I'm going to come down below computed, and we're just going to create a new methods key here. We're going to create that input event here, and as we discussed, it's going to have a native JavaScript event as the first argument. And what we're going to do here is just say this.emit, and we're going to emit, for now, just the new value. So we're going to say event.target.value. The next thing we're going to do is come up to my input, and we're going to listen for that event, and we have to actually put the name of the event as well. I'm just going to call it update for now. Let's go ahead and listen for the update event by using @update, and then we're just going to call a function called update here. And we're going to do the same thing for both username and password. The next thing we're going to need to do is come down here and define a new method. So I'm going to create a new methods key, and this one's going to have one called update. And the first argument is going to be the new value. So it's going to be called value. If we go ahead here and console log it, we're just going to make sure everything is still working as expected. And let's put in value and save everything off. And if we come back to our browser and start typing, we can see we're getting the new value for user and the new value for password down here as well. The only problem is we haven't got an easy way to update password and username because we don't know which value this is actually referring to, so we're going to have to include some more information. What I'm going to do is transform this from a regular value, and we're going to make it an object. We're going to include the information required to update the value. So in this case, we're going to have a value key, and that's just going to be the value. We're also going to have the name here, and that's going to be this.name. And this .name comes from the property we pass up here. So it's just going to be the name of the input. Let's head back over here and update this one. Instead of value, this is going to be payload, and we're just going to console log that payload. Let's now see what this is doing. So if I type into username now, and we're going to refresh the page, we're going to get an object which has the username and the value here, and this should be enough information for us. We have to note here that username has a capital U, but when we refer to it in our data function over here, it has a lowercase u, so we're going to have to make sure this is lowercase before we update it. So what I'm going to do here is just say this, and we're going to use the square brackets for a dynamic key, and this is just going to be payload.name, and then we're going to lowercase it to make sure it matches up, so I'm going to say to lowercase. So this is going to refer to either username or password here, and then we're going to say value is equal to payload.value, and that one's going to be the current value of whatever the user has typed. I'm going to go ahead and save this one off and try it out. So if we come over here, we should be able to type and see this is now working again as expected. It's required, now the minimum length is 5, and now it's valid. So everything is working exactly how it should be. Just to verify this, I'm going to use my string interpolation up here and see if it's working. So let's go ahead and just interpolate on Let's just pass the whole thing in. We're going to say username, and then we're going to do the same thing down here for password, just to make sure everything is working. Come over here again, and we can see its validity is false for both of these, and as I type, it's going to update both of these. So this is definitely an improvement. The next thing we're going to need to do is use the valid state and update the button effectively as well, and that's what we're going to do in the next video.